जय हिंद दोस्तों। In this video, I'll speak about S.T. Coleridge's Biographia Literaria. In the first place, I'll speak about his concept of poet, poem and poetry. In addition, I'll speak about his concept of imagination. I'll differentiate between primary imagination and secondary imagination. Moreover, I'll speak about his concept of fancy and again make comparison between fancy and imagination. To begin with, we have to distinguish between poetry and poem. We use these terms interchangeably, and even S.T. Coleridge is also using these terms interchangeably, but there is subtle difference. So according to Coleridge, what is poetry? So poetry is the result of poets. So poetry is the result of poets' imaginative activity. The poet's mind creates a unique world. Imagination plays very important part. It's a creative faculty, he says. Poet's mind creates a unique world, emotions and ideas through imagination. So we can understand the importance of imagination according to Coleridge, as it is creative activity or creating something new. A poem is the verbal expression of this poetic activity. A poem is the verbal expression of this poetic activity. A poem is an organic unity that provides pleasure through the appreciation of its interconnected parts. So the basic object of poetry is to provide pleasure, to give pleasure. Coleridge himself did not directly define a poem. To answer the question, what is poem? He answers that in order to understand the very concept of poem, we need to understand what is poet. So if we understand what is poet, we understand what is a poem. A poet is a man, he says, who brings his soul in operation with his separate faculties. In operation with his separate faculties arranged each to each according to their respective worth and dignity. Faculties such as intellect, reason and emotions are part, not whole of the soul. The poet with imaginative power unites all the parts of the soul. So imagination here plays very important part, because imaginative power unites all the parts of the soul and thus finds the ultimate reality behind things. So it is basically imaginative truth which makes poetry. Through the imaginative power, the distinction between the subject and the object unites. The knower and the known unites and thus reveal the ultimate reality. In the universe, everything has different body but has the same soul. So we find that poetry is the result of poet's imaginative activity. It's a creative faculty, and this creative faculty brings about certain kind of process, what we call poetry. The poet's mind creates a unique world, emotions and ideas through imagination. And as I have already said, the poem is the verbal expression of this poetic activity. So this is the difference between poetry and poem. It is the process. Poetry is the process that takes place in the mind of the poet, and poem is the verbal expression of this poetic activity. The very object of poetry or poem is to provide pleasure, and as attaining its end by the use of language natural to us in a state of excitement. Coleridge emphasizes The importance of deliberate thinking in poetry. This thinking is not just rational. Thinking always involves rational faculty. But Coleridge said that thinking is not just rational, but also emotional and imaginative. But also emotional and imaginative. Poetry, now he is using the term interchangeably. Poetry means poem. Poetry, or rather a poem, one and the same thing, is a species of composition opposed to science. Poetry is not like science, it is opposed to science as having intellectual pleasure for its object. Poetry provides us intellectual pleasure and at attaining its end by the use of language natural to us in a state of excitement but distinguished from other species of composition, not excluded by the former criterion, by permitting a pleasure from the whole consistent with a consciousness of pleasure from the component parts of poetry. The greatest immediate pleasure compatible with the largest sum of pleasure on the whole. So, the parts of poems provide us the greatest kind of pleasure, and the whole poem, the poem as whole, also provides us with the same kind of pleasure. Also provides us with same kind of pleasure. This of course will vary with the different modes of poetry, different kinds of poetry, and that splendor of particular lines which would be worthy of admiration in an impassioned elegy, satire would be a blemish and proof of wild taste in tragedy or an epic poem. So, all these kinds of poetry provide different kinds of pleasure, but they all provide pleasure. This is what S.T. Coleridge wants to say. Poetry aims to provide intellectual pleasure, enjoyment from understanding and appreciating the poem's meaning and artistry, how the poem is made, how the poem is composed. This distinguishes poetry from science, which seeks knowledge and truth. The aim of science is to provide you with knowledge and truth, but the aim of poetry or a poem is to provide you with pleasure, pleasure of highest kind. Poetry uses language natural to us in a state of excitement, language that expresses strong emotions and thoughts. The language is used to evoke feelings and ideas in the readers. Poetry allows the reader to experience pleasure from both the whole poem and its individual parts, lines, images, symbols, etc. etc. The poem's overall effect and its component parts work together to create a harmonious and enjoyable experience. Different modes of poetry, elegy, satire, tragedy, epic, have unique characteristics and requirements. What is admired in one type of poem might be inappropriate or even wild taste in another. Therefore, he said that whether it is elegy, satire, tragedy, epic, they provide different kinds of pleasure. The ultimate goal of poetry is to balance immediate pleasure from individual parts with the largest sum of pleasure from the whole poem. In summary, Coleridge defines poetry as a unique form of composition that attempts to provide intellectual pleasure through language that expresses strong emotions and thoughts. Poetry's perfection lies in balancing the pleasure from individual parts with the overall effect of the poem, varying according to the specific mode of poetry, as I said, whether it is elegy, whether it is tragedy, whether it is satire, whether it is epic. So different kinds of poetry provide you with different kinds of pleasure, but the ultimate aim of poetry is to provide you with pleasure. This is very important part. This is very important aspect that he is mentioning. This is very important proposition argument that St. Coleridge makes.